Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Luke Blackwell, and I am a member of the Temple of Ascending Flame. And today I am presenting on the topic of Baphomet, the mysterious goat of Mendes. The goal of this presentation is to kind of go over the Baphomet from a kind of historical analysis, not only talking about the development and the evolution of that figure, culminating in the familiar picture and image and idea of Baphomet as present in many occultic traditions, but also to kind of give some answers as to what it means. My presentation is not going to be absolutely definitive, but I think it's going to kind of give you enough information. In fact, a large variety of information that'll kind of put you on the right track to interpreting what it means. I'll also briefly use those sources and kind of interpret it from a Draconian tradition. After all, we are members of the Draconian current, so that is going to be the angle at which I analyze and look at the Baphomet. But I want to make this presentation because he is quite the mysterious figure. He's a figure that many occultic, even political organizations have claimed to fully understand, that they have the one exclusive read on what Baphomet is. Organizations like the Church of Satan, even political organizations like the Satanic Temple, various occultic traditions. Aleister Crowley has an interpretation of Baphomet. And all these kind of interpretations do contradict and conflict with each other. So I want to kind of give this presentation to be objective as to where it comes from, what it is, and kind of use that information to draw some conclusion for our practices as practitioners in the Draconian tradition. So the figure of Baphomet kind of emerges from two very famous images. The goat of Mendes image, which you can see in the bottom left of the slide, created by Kabbalist Eliphas Levi, and the sigil of Baphomet, which was created by a Rosicrucian or occultist, Stanislaw du Gaeta. This presentation will talk about Eliphas Levi's interpretation more so than Stanislaus de Gaeta. But, just to briefly mention the bottom right picture, it's an image of an upside-down pentagram. It has Samael and Lilith. It has a goat in the middle of the upside-down pentagram. And the Hebrew from the bottom symbol going counterclockwise spells the word Leviathan in Hebrew. And this image is famous to many different organizations and groups, often with the Samael and Lilith words removed. But it's kind of become a symbol of Satanism in general. What it means, I want to analyze this very briefly because I'm not really going to go into it that much in this presentation, but more generally speaking, the kind of upside-down pentagram typically refers to the embrace of the material rather than the spiritual, or the subordination of the spiritual to the material. The goat's obviously a well-known image associated with Satan, and I'll get into that in this presentation. But also, there is a corresponding right-side-up pentagram with Adam and Eve, with another set of Hebrew letters. So, in that Adam and Eve sigil kind of represents kind of like an ideal divine man. Maybe Adam Kadmon, or perhaps Christ. So therefore, the Samael and Lilith pentagram kind of represents the dark side or night side of that. But overall, my main focus is going to be on the bottom left image, and that image, which comes from Eliphas Levi. And it's an image that actually derives from centuries of pagan and Abrahamic motifs and ideas. So that's what I'm going to do in this presentation, kind of look at the historical sources and kind of draw some conclusions from a Draconian perspective. So what is the Baphomet? Where does it come from? The name Baphomet, in reference to something esoteric, first emerges in the 14th century. There's an organization called the Knights Templar, the Crusaders, back in the medieval days, wanted to take pilgrimages to the Holy Land, and that's a very dangerous journey. They didn't have cars or planes like we do today. So this organization was established by the Roman Catholic Church to aid pilgrims in traveling to the Holy Land, providing them self-defense and making sure they have safe travel. And as you can imagine, it became a really powerful political organization to such a degree that the Crusaders actually ran their own governments. There did exist in history monk-run governments in Europe. That's how powerful they got. But in 1307, the King of France claimed that the Knights Templar, which is one of the Crusader organizations, was infected by a secret cult that was pagan and demonic, and it worshipped this deity or entity called Baphomet. According to many of these Crusaders or Knights Templars were put under torture, and they confessed that they were part of the secret cult where they worshipped what is this kind of like severed head that they called Baphomet. And as part of their ritual organization, they were required to renounce Christ and spit on the cross and identify Baphomet as the source of salvation. I believe there were also allegations of magical occult practices that were being used with this Baphomet head. But eventually, the Knights Templar, because of these accusations, did eventually get disbanded. Most scholars today kind of come to a consensus that this secret cult is all fabricated, that there's not even like a hint of truth to any of these allegations. And this is one of those episodes of mass church hysteria where people are religiously fanatic and they come up with their own fantasies and they created these delusions. And as to the scholarly consensus where the name Baphomet comes from, many think it comes from the Islamic prophet Muhammad. That's actually a corrupted version of the name Muhammad. You can transliterate Muhammad as Mahomet or Mahomet, and then you change the M to a B and it becomes Baphomet. We do have a source from the 11th century where many Crusaders thought they heard Muhammad as Baphomet, literally. So that's kind of why the scholarly consensus is the way it is. However, I would argue that scholarly consensus doesn't always equal to absolute truth. For many, myself included, it is a little bit strange that we have this very detailed secret cult that just kind of emerges out of nowhere, and people just chalk it away like it was just made up out of a situation of mass hysteria. It's strange that we'd have multiple confessions all kind of describe very similar practices and ideas independently of each other, and that this episode even happened at such a high political level. I mean, it's possible, but even if a lot of these ideas are exaggerated and not really fully true in history, I like to imagine that something happened. There had to be some kind of level of truth to those accusations for it to even come to existence. People don't just typically make up highly detailed systems and religions and ideas from nothing out of the blue. They typically build off all older ideas, or there is some distortion about what happened. But regardless of whether how historical this secret cult was, this secret cult would dominate in culture for centuries. It influenced not only many different cultural and political, cultural and media things. For example, Dan Brown in the Da Vinci Code references this incident. But many occultic and religious organizations would claim to sense to this Knights Templar secret cults. The Freemasons claimed they were upholding the secret doctrine of the Knights Templar. Aleister Crowley claimed that he unveiled the true secret of the Knights Templar. The Rosicrucians claimed the same thing. They all claim to be the true heirs. They have the true lineage to this secret Knights Templar cult practice and the secret doctrine. Of course, the Freemasons, Aleister Crowley, and Rosicrucians all have different ideas of the Baphomet and what this cult was. But it goes to show you the power that this episode in history had in our cultural consciousness. So in the 19th century, there was this author, Joseph Freiherr Hammer Purgstall, who wrote a book about the Baphomet. And he went around to various museums in Europe and found these alleged, I want to emphasize they're alleged figures that come from the 13th century that were supposedly used in the worship of the Knights Templar. These are some of the images that I pulled from his book, which I found online. And some of the recurring themes is a solar and lunar aspect. There's sometimes a depiction of a bearded man or a child. Usually there's Arabic inscriptions and pentagrams or stars. But one common motif is the presence of both masculine and feminine physical characteristics. So, for example, in all these pictures, you do have images of female breasts or female genitalia, but masculine-looking figures. Some of these figures also have a beard, even though they have these female parts. And then, of course, in the second from the left image, we have a famous figure of a horned figure with a beard and breasts. These Joseph Freiherr Hammer Purgstall all claimed that this is what the Baphomet was. This was the idol that they were secretly worshiping. While the Confessors all claimed it was like a severed head. Joseph Fryer Hammer Perksel claimed that no, these ideas are what the idol really was. Perksel claimed that it was a Gnostic deity, and I'll get into this later in this presentation, but Gnosticism is kind of a complicated, detailed word, but it typically refers to systems of Christian ideas that believe that the God of the Old Testament is really an evil, malevolent entity, and that there's a higher God that's transcendent. So I think you can interpret Perksel's ideas as claiming that this entity represented some kind of higher deity who was beyond the creator of this world. Building off of these ideas and many other ideas, we finally get the homogenization of these ideas of the Knights Templar, the idea of Perksel's images, and they kind of codify themselves in the well-known Baphomet image that we know from Eliphas Levi. Eliphas Levi was initially a Catholic priest who eventually pursued a career as a Catholic priest before becoming a ceremonial magician. And this image appears in his book, Transcendental Magic, Its Doctrine and Ritual. The Baphomet, that's when it first appears, but it also appears in the book, The Mysteries of Kabbalah, or the agreement between the two testaments, and I'll get into that. He also explains in both books what he thinks this image was and what it represents, and I'm going to get into that in this presentation. Eliphas Levi's ideas of the Baphomet are interesting. I think many people have heard that, well, the Baphomet doesn't really represent the devil or Satan. It represents like the God. It represents the transcending of dualities. It doesn't represent something evil. But then you'll get religious figures who will claim that, well, no, the Baphomet actually represents the devil. It's satanic, and there's also satanic practitioners who will claim that. And from Eliphas Levi's perspective, both are actually correct. So Eliphas Levi denies that Satan as an entity exists. He denies that evil exists. He believes evil and darkness is merely a personification of errors, perversities, and consequences. It represents kind of the impediment on the spiritual path, not something that actually exists in reality. Eliphas Levi claims that religious systems in general, whether they are the Abrahamic traditions or the pagan traditions, they're kind of symbolic, magical toolkits that allow one to spiritually transcend. They all have their own various rules and limitations, and figures of evil are kind of contextual within each of these religious systems. So, for example, the Baphomet within the Abrahamic context, in Eliphas Levi's mind, does represent the devil. He makes that very clear. Baphomet represents the devil, Satan, the serpent in the garden. And it is the blind force which souls must overcome to be free of the chains to their earth in order to ascend and spiritually transcend to a higher level of existence. For him, the whole of the magical work is liberation from the folds of this ancient serpent. So the creator of this Baphomet image very clearly says that the Baphomet does represent the devil and Satan. Levi claims that evil is fundamentally the misdirected use of will when it's blindly used, but he very explicitly denies the existence of evil. He actually looks at some religious systems that do acknowledge an evil, and he mocks those religions. He claims that those who believe in a duad or a dyad of darkness, who believe there's a dark primordial force that's a counterpart to the light, are insane. They have illogical minds. They are a product of sectarian fancies and manias. While he does associate the Baphomet with evil and Satan, he does acknowledge that within a pagan magical system, the Baphomet can actually be a positive system. It's merely a positive hieroglyphic. Baphomet can be identified with the Greek god Pan. It can also be identified with as the god of Alexandrian magic, the god of Plato, and even within certain Gnostic systems, Jesus Christ himself. And Eliphas Levi, in his book, where this image appears, does say that. So he has these two kind of contradictory notions, but I think the way to reconcile these contradictory notions is to understand that it really is contextual in how this symbol is used. I want to point this up in terms of in this presentation, I'm going to kind of go into the artistic and labels that Eliphas Levi uses with the Baphomet, but I think it's important to kind of analyze what the Baphomet is from more of an artistic perspective. If you couldn't tell, the pose that the Baphomet's in, pointing upwards and downwards, seems to borrow from Christian motifs of Christ in the Last Judgment. So Last Judgment in Christian apocalyptic theology is when people are judged and sentenced to heaven or hell. And in many medieval and older depictions of Christ, he's pointing upwards and downwards. And in religious iconography and artwork, especially in the Christian tradition, whenever a saint or a figure points to something, they're redirecting you as the viewer to consider what they're pointing to. So there's many artistic depictions of the Virgin Mary where Mary points to Christ. If she's holding the baby Jesus, she'll often point to the baby Jesus. So Christ in these images is pointing upwards and downwards, probably encouraging devotees of Christianity to reflect on where their soul might end up. They might end up upwards or downwards, heaven or hell. I think it's fair to actually look at the Baphomet and interpret that image from a similar perspective. The Baphomet is in fact pointing upwards and downwards, and he is encouraging us to contemplate what exactly he's pointing to. He's encouraging us to contemplate the relationship between the above and the below, and this can not only relate to the spiritual and the material, but also, from more spiritual perspective, the heavenly and the chthonic, the heaven and hell, and the relationship between those two. As a figure, the Baphomet is a figure of contradictory dualities. He has both male and female genitalia. He has body parts of both a man and a woman. He has the face of a goat, which is associated with the devil and Satan, but he also has an upright pentagram, which associates with something good. If we believe Eliphas Levi that the Baphomet can represent the Gnostic Christ, I think it's pretty safe to assume that he borrowed the posture of Christ in the Baphomet image. Even though it is a figure of polarities and contradictions, one way you can interpret the goat head is the prioritization of the animal over the spiritual or the man, right? So, the mind is typically in religious context something separate from the flesh or the passions, but here in this image of the Baphomet, we have an image of the animal in the mind. So the animal prioritized over the mind. So it is, in some sense, the subordination of the spiritual to the material or the flesh or the passions, right? And I'll get into this later, but the goat is a symbol of Satan, and there's many reasons why. So Eliphas Levi's Baphomet also appears in his other book, The Mysteries of Kabbalah, and he explains that within the Jewish or Abrahamic system, the hostility of towards idolatry is merely symbolic. So in his mind, the development towards the spiritual is that of recognizing that these symbols and deities and entities aren't literal beings, but represent something higher than themselves. So he claims that the Jews were brilliant in denying the presence of idols because it is an explicit encouragement to look beyond the mere symbols and ideas as they are, but look to what they actually represent. So within the Abrahamic context, of course, an animalistic deity or idol is something that's evil because it represents entrapment into the mere symbol itself rather than what the symbol represents. And then in his book, he has these images that are associated with the Baphomet. He has this serpentine rooster cock that he identifies with Abraxas, the philosopher's dragon. He has a picture of the Baphomet, which he calls Azima, and he claims it's the same as Mendes, and is associated with Eros and physical love. And then there's, of course, the upside down pentagram, which he identifies with Lucifer with the goat head. In general, Eliphas Levi creates this image of the Baphomet from, not images of Christ, but in these Perkstall images that we've shown before, but also the idea of the goat of Mendes and other kind of cultural ideas, which we'll get into shortly. So, while many scholars think the name Baphomet is a corrupted version of Muhammad, I believe there are actually a lot of different possibilities of where the name comes from. We have one source, Christopher Nicolai, and in fact, Perkstall himself claims to have figured out what the name Baphomet means. They claim that the name comes from the Greek Baphometes, or the bath of wisdom, or the baptism of wisdom. Crowley also seems to come to the same conclusion that that's what the Baphomet means, because he claims that many of his ritual ideas use this phrase, the baptism of wisdom, repeatedly. There's another possible interpretation, Hugh Schoenfeld, who says that's a Hebrew cipher, that if you take the name Baphomet in Hebrew and you inverse the letters, where the first letter becomes the last letter and the second letter becomes the second last letter, you get the word Sophia, which is a transliteration of the Greek in Hebrew letters, which represents the word for wisdom. It's a divine concept within Abrahamic religion and thought. So it's entirely possible the name Baphomet kind of comes from these kind of magical riddles and ciphers. Ciphers were heavily used in the occult and history. John Dee famously used the Enochian language, which he invented as a cipher for messages. So that is a part of the Western occult tradition. So that is entirely a plausible interpretation of what the Baphomet might actually mean. But, if you actually look at the historical sources of the Baphomet in history, there are similar names to the name Baphomet that also might be what the name comes from. So, first and foremost, I think we should connect Baphomet to the idea of Leviathan. So, within Islam and Arabic mythology, the Arabic interpretation of Abrahamic mythology, there is this primordial sea fish or even serpentine entity called Bahamut. And it's actually an Arabic rendering of the name Behemoth, which pops up in the Bible. I go into this in another presentation of mine, but essentially, while Behemoth and Leviathan can, in some interpretations, refer to literal animals, there is, in fact, an idea that these represent spiritual entities that are primordial entities. Within Genesis, God creates three categories of animals: land animals, sea animals, and air animals. And it seems like Leviathan and Behemoth represent the primordial spirit or animalistic spirit that governs the sea animals and then the land animals respectively. That is to say, Leviathan represents the primordial entity that governs the sea animals and is kind of like the primordial embodiment of the sea animal, whereas Behemoth is the primordial governing entity of the land animals. However, the Muslims screwed up their mythology and they mixed up Behemoth with Leviathan. And within Islam, Bahamut actually refers to the primordial sea serpent or fish entity. So in Islam, Bahamut is the Leviathan. Curiously, of course, as I pointed out earlier in one of my earlier slides, if I go back to it, the Hebrew in the sigil Baphomet is Leviathan and references that entity. So is that a coincidence, or is there in fact a real historical meaning of that word? And quite frankly, if you take the name Muhammad, and that could be so easily corrupted by Baphomet, I don't understand why it would be such a stretch to assume that the name Baphomet could easily be corrupted, or the name Bahamut could easily be corrupted into Baphomet. There's actually a deep Kabbalistic interpretation of Leviathan, which I think is incredibly relevant to the concept of Baphomet. The name, according to the Rabbi Rashi, claims that the Leviathan has this connotation of conjugal union. It represents this kind of union of sorts. It comes from the Hebrew word lava, which means to unify, and it's used in the context of marriage. So the name Leviathan has this kind of sense of duality to it. If you go to the Zohar, which is a collection of texts that kind of explain the Jewish Kabbalah, the Zohar claims that Satan's actually a composite entity of two spirits, Samael and Leviathan. One who represents the serpent, Lilith, and one who represents him who rides on the serpent, or Samael. In the book of Genesis, many rabbis will claim that Satan or Samael possessed the serpent to talk. And that becomes kind of an esoteric idea of the serpent being this two-force spirit that's unified together. There's a famous book called The Treatise of Left Lemonation by Rabbi Isaac ben Jacob HaKohen. I apologize if I butcher that name. That very clearly claims that the Leviathan is in fact the conjugal union of Samael and Lilith, and that's exactly what it is. It's like Samael's the masculine spiritual air spirit, and Lilith is the feminine serpentine spirit. The two together are the full manifestation of Satan or Leviathan, and that's what Leviathan refers to. It represents the fully unified serpent. He actually says that God separates these two spirits because the union of those spirits would mean the complete destruction and abolition of the world. The full bringing on of Satan is the full bringing on of destruction and death. So therefore, God hinders Samael and Lilith by separating them into two beings and preventing them from fully unifying. It suggests, of course, that Yahweh or God split Leviathan into two, and it seems to be referenced in Psalm 104, 5-9, with God separating the primordial waters into two parts. The Zohar actually further explains that this unholy union of Samael and Lilith is called Azazel. So in the Trees of Left Emanation, that particular rabbi calls it Leviathan, but the Zohar calls this union Azazel. Azazel, if you don't know, is the name of the scapegoat that is offered on Yom Kippur. The Jews, as part of ritual ceremony, offer two goats, one to Azazel and one to Yahweh. And the Jews spiritually pass on their sins onto the goat that's offered to Azazel as like a filthy, contaminated goat that they offer into the wilderness. So when we look at the image of the Baphomet as a goat entity, it's possible that the goat imagery actually comes from these Jewish and Kabbalistic ideas of Samael and Lilith as well as Azazel. The goat is also associated with the Bible. Many people will like to claim that the goat association of Satan is purely a pagan idea that comes from Christianity later, and there's probably some truth to that, but the goat is heavily associated with Satan throughout the Old Testament and the New Testament. So in Daniel 8, there's a reference to this goat who emerges from the west and tramples down on the host of heaven. It's a he-goat. And the Bible also frequently mentions these goat satyr demons called the Serim. In Leviticus 17:7, there's a commandment that you're not allowed to offer sacrifices to these goat demons. And interestingly enough, while the literal word means goats, I believe the same word pops up in Isaiah and in the Greek Septuagint translation of this word Serim from the Hebrew. The word is essentially rendered as like donkey centaur. So there is clearly some kind of idea of the Serim being some kind of spiritual satyr-like goat entity that's associated with the devil. These Kabbalistic ideas within Judaism actually parallel older conceptions too. So, of course, I think most famously, one of the oldest mythologies we have is Mesopotamian mythology. And there's a story of this primordial mother serpentine goddess named Tiamat, who represents and personifies the salt waters, and she has a consort named Apsu who personifies the fresh waters. She eventually gives birth to children that eventually leads to the creation of Marduk, who's the king of the gods, the lightning god. And he violently overthrows Tiamat and splits up her body into several parts, and using the parts of her body creates the whole cosmos. So Marduk, this lightning god, wages this personification of the primordial waters, which personifies chaos, and then from chaos creates the world. I would encourage, and there is in fact a connection within the Bible itself. The word for chaos in Hebrew is tehom. You can find this word in Genesis when God descends on the deep or the waters. The word tehom in Hebrew comes from the word Tiamat. So there is obviously some Mesopotamian mythological influence on the Abrahamic mythology. So there is probably, in fact, a direct connection between Leviathan and Tiamat. But there's also a similar story that pops up in Hinduism as well. I'm pretty sure that's a Vedic idea and that the deity was originally Indra, who was also a lightning god. But more modern renditions render Indra as Vishnu. So the gods and the Astros were churning the ocean of milk, which is like the primordial waters. It's viewed as milk within Hinduism. And the gods are able to create the elixir of life, which gives immortality to all who drink it. So the gods kept them for themselves, so they would live forever while the demons would die off. One of the big demons, Sarvanu, which is a serpent deity, a serpent demon, steals this elixir of life and drinks it, making him immortal. And as punishment, Vishnu severs his head and he splits it into two demonic entities: a serpentine male deity demon and a female serpentine deity, Rahu and Ketu. Within Hinduism, these entities are seen as responsible for solar eclipses and lunar eclipses. The head, Rahu, will try to swallow the sun and the moon, which causes the eclipse, but because his neck is severed, the moon and the sun go through his neck, which means that all solar eclipses come to an end. And typically in Hinduism, as well as other cultures, a solar eclipse is viewed as a pretty negative event. It represents chaos and disorder covering the cosmos. So it kind of represents this kind of disorder that's brought into the harmony of the cosmos when this happens within Hinduism. And I like to think there has to be some kind of connection between the Kabbalistic idea of Leviathan as well as the idea of Tiamat. It can't be a coincidence that there's these primordial demonic serpentine entities associated with the snake who kind of embody chaos and destruction, who are then split into two in order to preserve the order of the cosmos. The fact that that's very specific and detailed across his religious system, I don't think is a coincidence. And then in my pictures, in the bottom left, I have a picture of the dead corpse of Leviathan, I think, relevant for this presentation. And then I have the picture of the Baphomet, or the Islamic idea, which is the serpentine primordial entity governing the sea animals. But of course, going on to beyond that, Eliphas Levi also claims that this Baphomet is the goat of Mendes. What the hell is this goat of Mendes? What is he talking about? So another possible derivative of the name Baphomet might be a corrupt form of the name Banajadet. I may be butchering that horribly, I apologize. But Banajadet was actually a deity that was worshipped in ancient Egypt that is an ancient ram-headed Egyptian deity. Sometimes he's depicted with 4 heads, sometimes depicted with 1 head. And he was actually identified with Osiris, who was the god of the dead. He was interpreted as a specific variant of Osiris in the area of Mendes. But most historians think that he was actually a ram-headed deity rather than a goat-headed deity. So what is Eliphas Levi talking about with the goat of Mendes? Well, funnily enough, the ancient Greeks actually thought that they were worshiping a goat-headed deity. The ancient Greek historian Herodotus believes that this deity was actually Pan, and because Pan is this goat satyr deity, that the ancient Egyptians were actually worshiping a goat-headed deity in the realm of Mendes. So that's where we kind of get this idea of the goat of Mendes. Of pointing out, however, is that the Egyptian god Osiris does get identified with Dionysus. Herodotus, earlier in this same exact work, his histories, he claims that Osiris, who's the ruler of the dead and the ruler of the underworld, is actually the Greek god Dionysus. Not only is the goat a famous animal and symbol of Dionysus, but in various religious festivals, a goat would be sacrificed in sometimes the blood drink in honor of Dionysus. But also in Ovid's Metamorphoses in Book 5, the serpentine entity Titan tries to devour the gods, so Dionysus flees to Egypt and disguises himself as a goat in hiding. And this is supposed to explain why the goat is such a sacred animal to Dionysus. And of course, there is that interesting connection, Dionysus is a goat in Egypt. This connection becomes even more explicit, however, when the Greeks actually conquer Egypt under Alexander the Great, and then when Rome, having the same mythology as the Greek mythology, also conquers Egypt. The Egyptian gods change drastically when the Greeks and Romans conquer them, and they become syncretized with the Greek gods. And Osiris not only gets identified with Dionysus, but he also gets identified with King Hades as the ruler of the underworld. Osiris is the god of the dead, so it only makes sense that King Hades, who's the ruler of the underworld, becomes identified with Osiris in Greek mythology. And again, those older kind of notions of the ram-headed deity from Mendes actually get incorporated as normative, or the norm, for the worship of this syncretized Osiris Greek-Egyptian deity, which becomes known as Serapis. He also gets identified with serpents, and he's involved in various rites that are connected to both Dionysus and King Hades. This deity, Serapis, was extremely popular all throughout the ancient Greco-Roman world, and he gets repeatedly mentioned he gets mentioned by name at least once, in a famous work called the Greek Magical Papyri. The Greek Magical Papyri is this collection of ancient Greek magic that we have preserved. In this work, influences a lot of Solomonic and magical Abrahamic ideas, including Kabbalistic ideas. The Greek Magical Papyri gets referenced almost directly in a very ancient Hebrew source called the Sword of Moses, which is this compilation of angelic magic and about the transformation of one's inner nature into that of an angel so they can join in heaven with God. But also the Magical Treatise of Solomon seems to have direct references to the Greek Magical Papyri, the Magical Treatise of Solomon directly influencing a lot of later Kabbalistic ideas. but also the Magical Key of Solomon, which becomes a fundamental occultic text embracing Judaic ideas. Finally, I'd like to talk about the historical pagan kind of conception of the hermaphrodite. Well, it's not finally. I have one more thing after this, so I guess I lied to you, but this is the main big thing I'm going to talk about. The hermaphrodite is kind of a pagan idea that, in its oldest mention, as far as I'm aware, is brought up in Plato's Symposium. It's a unique, fascinating idea from Plato, and it's an interesting question how literally we take it. But in this story, humanity supposedly existed as a being of two heads and like 4 arms and 4 legs, so like 8 limbs, and and humanity was originally like an androgynous, hermaphroditic type of being who tried to wage war against Zeus and the gods, and as punishment, Zeus split them up into 2 beings. And this is supposed to explain, in Plato's mind, why humanity desires love. They desire completion, why they feel incomplete without having a partner with them and living with them, romantically involved with them, unifying with them. Because it calls to a primordial time where man actually had both genders contained within. Many would argue, including myself, that this famous kind of Greek story does influence a lot of esoteric and occultic traditions, particularly when it comes to Hermeticism, where the hermaphroditic image is used. One famous Greek tradition that seems to, as time progresses, incorporate Platonic ideas is Orphism. I've talked about this religious idea in other presentations, but the Orphics conceived of Dionysus as the primordial first god. He was a hermaphroditic deity that emerged out of chaos, and then gave birth to his twin sister, Nyx, or the goddess of night, and the two together created the whole cosmos and established order in the cosmos. This primordial Dionysus is called Phanes, and he's identified with Eros, the passions. And he's also identified with the sun and a solar deity. Nyx, therefore, is the feminine lunar night counterpart to Phanes. She is the deity of night and the moon, whereas this Phanes, this primordial Dionysus, is the deity of the sun and the masculine deity. And this was mind-blowing when I came across this, but this Greek Orphic conception seems to directly influence a really famous Luciferian text called the Gospel of Aradia, which is from the 19th century and purports to preserve this ancient Greek cult dedicated to Lucifer and the goddess Diana. Lucifer is specifically identified as the first god and this kind of solar primordial god, with his consort being Diana, the goddess of the moon. And the two not only establish the divine cult of witchcraft, but also eventually lead to the creation of the cosmos. The Gospel of Aradia, as a text, is fundamentally influential in so many different occultic traditions, specifically because it helps influence the establishment of Wicca. Wicca, there's not only a lot of mythological reference in Wicca to this text, but you can also see the connection between the horned masculine god of Wicca and the triple goddess, lunar goddess of Wicca, and how that relates to both Lucifer as the primordial solar deity and Diana as the lunar deity. And make no mistake, the Gospel of Aradia very specifically identifies this Lucifer as the fallen angel Lucifer. In the chapter 1 of its book. It's a book I highly encourage you to read. But there is an interesting connection there between these kind of older Orphic Greek ideas and this Gospel of Aradia. Now, the legitimacy of the Gospel of Aradia is one that's kind of subject to historical questioning. Some people think that the author fabricated it, but I don't know. I think again, it's like the Templars. I think there's probably something historically truth about it because it is reflecting older Greek ideas. And obviously there's some kind of connection between Lucifer and Dionysus in terms of his imagery. Typically, if we kind of view the hermaphrodite as a reunion back to primordial, whether we draw on these older Platonic ideas of going back to finding our own inner completion within ourselves, or, kind of going back to the first hermaphroditic Greek deity, that's an idea that becomes a motif all throughout Greek occultic tradition, and then, of course, later Kabbalistic tradition, and enacted in what's usually called the alchemical wedding or the alchemical union, where your inner masculine and feminine energies are fully harmonized in one with each other, and one finds full spiritual completeness within themselves, and it establishes themselves in the form of the divine. But there is also one other way you can view these kind of dualities, not just between a balancing of masculine and feminine energies, but also balance between light and darkness and good and evil. And I'd like to point to Zoroastrianism. Zoroastrianism is an ancient Persian sect that directly influences Abrahamic mythology. Within Zoroastrianism, there is this spiritual light father figure, Ahura Mazda, who you can't depict in images, who has these spiritual sons and entities who govern the cosmos. And then there's this evil, dark counterpart, horned entity called Ahriman, who represents everything that's evil and chaotic and has demons that serve him. Even some Abrahamic demons like Asmodeus can actually be traced to the Zoroastrian religion. And as the Jews were governed by Persians who were Zoroastrian religion for, a set amount of time, they obviously took influence from that, and that developed their religion. I think that's pretty clear. There's an ancient Jewish archaeological remains where they're worshiping Yahweh as Ahura Mazda within Elephantine, Egypt, during the Hellenic period. They're using Zoroastrian tools in the worship of Yahweh, so it's very clear there's some Zoroastrian influence on Abrahamic mythology. But there is actually a heretical sect of Zoroastrianism called Zurvanism, which believed that there's actually a higher deity that transcends the dualities of light and darkness, good and evil. That there's a higher deity beyond Ahura Mazda, this light father figure, and the evil, dark Ahriman figure, the Satan figure. And they called this deity Zurvan, and he was depicted as this lion-headed serpent deity. And then Persian religion gets incorporated, just like Egyptian religion, into Greek mythology in a cult called Mithraism. And I would argue that a lot of the ideas of Zurvanism tend to, at least iconographically, influence Mithraism, at least in terms of artwork, because Zurvan is depicted as a lion serpentine deity, and we find these lion serpent deity images, which you can find in the bottom right. That's from a Mithraic temple, where these Mithric disciples were using in the religious liturgy and their own religious worship. Some of these depictions of the lion-headed serpent are called Ahriman, and I do want to point out that there is kind of a trace of this Zurvan idea, at least in terms of analogy, within the history of Christianity, because Christianity is a sect of Abrahamic ideas and Hellenic ideas, and they kind of get merged together. St. Hippolytus of Rome mentions this heresy called the Justinian heresy that believed that Yahweh had this goddess consort named Edem, which is the Greek rendering of the word Eden. She's a goddess that has two parts. She's beautiful in the upper half of her body, but she's like gross and animalistic in the lower half of her body. And Yahweh eventually divorces her, goes on to heaven, and out of rage, this goddess gives birth to the demons. Satan and the like, but Yahweh comes across a higher higher deity, which is beyond Yahweh, and called the good, and Yahweh becomes kind of the vessel in which the good manifests in the world. And this is what this heretical sect supposedly believed in. Interesting enough, this higher deity is called Priapus in St. Hippolytus of Rome, and Priapus was actually a title of Phanists on this slide. It was actually another nickname for him. So there is some weird influence of Orphism on Christianity at some level. And then, of course, Abraxas, again, is the higher Gnostic deity that represents the deity that's beyond Yahweh. There's some probable connection between that and the Justinian heretics. And he's above that. And he's depicted as this rooster-headed deity with animalistic and human parts. To bring this around full circle, because I know this is a lot of information, the bottom left is actually a Templar seal we retrieved from that time period, which has the god Abraxas used on the coinage the Templars produce. So for some reason, these Templars were producing these coins with Abraxas on it, but I guess there is no real historical reason why this Baphomet issue popped up at all. Also pointing out, Yahweh is identified by Plutarch as Dionysus because they had similar worship and ideas. So this is a lot of information, and of course, it doesn't all neatly fall together. There's some kind of contradictory notions and ideas between all of these different historical sources that might have led to the development and influence of Baphomet. However, I would argue that it was worth bringing it to your attention because there are a lot of striking similarities and coincidences that don't feel just like coincidences. There's probably something real and tangible to these shared overlapping ideas. However, in the Temple of Ascending Flame, Samael is kind of identified with the goat of Mendes. He's identified with the black goat of the unholy witch's Sabbath. One of the sigils that we actually use for Samael within the Draconian tradition depicts Samael with these ram horns. But I don't think the Draconian tradition specifically worships any entity identified as Baphomet. I think Baphomet, in terms of some of his attributes, gets conflated with Samael, and certainly some ideas of Baphomet do influence other ideas and workings within the Draconian tradition. While I think these older pagan conceptions are important, I think it should be stressed within the Draconian tradition that if we were to interpret Baphomet in a certain correct way, we do have to acknowledge those darker, chaotic, chthonic elements of the Baphomet. I think that is probably the proper reading of that within the Draconian tradition. The Draconian tradition's not a path for the faint-hearted. It's not a path of light, joy, happiness, sunshine, and no suffering at all. It is a path of passion, challenges, and strength and willpower, which is something that emerges when you interact with a lot of the chthonic entities that those within the Draconian tradition work with. So I think necessarily you do have to incorporate those kind of perhaps evil or dark element interpretations of Baphomet as the devil, these Ahrimanic ideas, these Kabbalistic ideas of Baphomet being the Leviathan. I think those kind of darker interpretations are incredibly important within our own practice and working. But that isn't to downplay the original pagan roots of the Baphomet as well. I think that many people in the West are trapped in a false history where they believe that the Bible's literally true. There was Yahweh and God, and then he just created everything, and everyone was worshiping the God of Judaism, and then all these nasty pagans corrupted everything, and we need to get back to the original pure Judaism. That is a false history. There is centuries of pagan tradition that predates Abrahamism, that does influence Abrahamism. So acknowledging the pagan dimension of that is important. I would argue that the Draconian tradition is largely a pagan tradition that doesn't believe that, Satan just exists as a subordinate to Yahweh and we just, worship evil and that's it. I think it's more nuanced than that. These deities do exist independent of themselves and have their own paths that they define on their own terms. So therefore, understanding the kind of pagan conception of Baphomet is important for this path as well. So I think both are important, and that's the kind of conclusion you should come from all these resources and information. However, I did present this information in its kind of naked, pure state for you to draw your own conclusions as to what all this means. And I have my sources here. It's a lot of sources. And that's it. Thank you for watching my presentation. I hope it was informative and helpful, and I hope you got something out of it. Thank you.